One of the nation's preeminent bioethicists, Professor Meilaender has written extensively on the body, human identity, and the meaning of emerging technologies. He received his PhD from Princeton University, and before coming to Valparaiso in 1996, taught at the University of Virginia and at Oberlin College. He served on the editorial board and as an associate editor of the Journal of Religious Ethics, and as an associate editor for Religious Studies Review. He's on the editorial board of the Annual of the Society of Christian Ethics and on the editorial advisory board of First Things. He's a fellow of the Hastings Center and was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2002 to 2008. Professor Meilaender is the author of numerous works, including Friendship, a Study in Theological Ethics, Theory and Practice of Virtue, and the inaugural volume in the De Nicola Center's Catholic Ideas for a Secular World book series with University of Notre Dame Press titled Not by Nature, but by Grace, Forming Families Through Adoption. Welcome, Professor Meilaender.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to stand up to talk. I just think better standing up. I won't wander around, though, so I think I'll stay by the mic. If you can't hear me, you should do something. I'm not sure what. But you're hearing me okay right now? Yes. Okay. If I start to mumble, let me know. We live in a time that claims to value difference and diversity, that is, say, openness to the differences, the differences that distinguish people from each other. And it's true, of course, that those differences, that we like them on some occasions, they can give us a sense of belonging, a sense of solidarity when we're with the people who are like us in important ways. But I think that very fact, the fact that can make us feel good to be with those who are like us, can also sometimes make us feel just a little bit guilty. Guilty for not being more universally open than we are. Experiencing ourselves, as we usually do, as being particularly attached to some people much more than others, can seem problematic to us. Universal openness means that there shouldn't be any walls that separate people. Now, in our political life, of course, this has recently given rise to a lot of conversations, so-called populist or nationalist movements that emphasize the need for special attachments, the need to belong, the need for what Rusty Reno has called the strong gods that unite people, that give us a sense of belonging, of having a home. In Reno's account, and in the view of some others who more or less share his political concerns, this homelessness and borderlessness is largely a function of 20th century civilizational catastrophes in the West, the fruit of 2 destructive world wars and of the Holocaust. Because those wars were powered by passionate but often limited loves and attachments, it has seemed to some people that the cure must be greater openness. Less attention to particular attachments that separate us, a sense that the bond of our shared humanity is more important than the narrower ties of our special loves. Now, I do not intend to take up those political questions today. You may be glad to know. We hear plenty about them these days. I'm going to focus on something that is less likely to get the attention of a congressional committee or the president, the love of friendship. But in so doing, I'm going to be led to wonder, just wonder, you understand, not making it stronger than that, but I'm going to be led to wonder whether our problem may not be something that goes a little deeper even than 20th century upheavals. I'm going to wonder whether the culprit may not be something more like Christianity. We wouldn't have to think about friendship to make this point, although since the conference is about friendship, it seems as if I probably should do that. But just for example, we could take up the same problem thinking about the family. Surely one of the most important places of human belonging, of having a home. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that in every human person we see a son or daughter of the one who wants to be called our Father. Now, if true, that might make us wonder whether we ought not sit just a little looser to our familial ties, whether we should not learn to expand our loves beyond the limits that come naturally to us and give us a sense of identity and belonging. We might come to think of the family bond as a problem. For, as Michael Walzer, the political theorist, very succinctly put it on one occasion, favoritism begins in the family. Or to turn to an even higher authority than Michael Walzer, Jesus says, "If you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? If you love those who love you," Jesus says, "you do nothing very special. Even the tax collectors do the same." I want to think about this problem in relation to friendship, which in some way raises it even more acutely than the family bond does. The family bond you just find yourself in, for better or worse, it's there, and some obligations seem to come along with it. Friendships are chosen, and you wouldn't have to single out people for that sort of preference. And so I want to think about the problem that Christian faith raises for the kind of attachment that friends have for one another. To do this, of course, the first thing we need to do is characterize the bond of friendship, and I will start to do that where almost everybody starts, with Aristotle. I should say that along the way, I will be using several Greek words. The reason mainly is one gets tired of saying the love that Christians especially praise, or some complicated locution like that. That's agape. I'll just call that agape. I'll use philia for friendship. And I will also here and there mention two other Greek terms, eros and philanthropia. Aristotle defines philia, friendship, at least his beginning definition is that friendship, philia, is reciprocated and mutually aware goodwill. That is to say, you have goodwill for your friend has goodwill for you, and you are both aware of the goodwill each has for the other. But this goodwill can have several different grounds, and that will make for rather different kinds of friendship. We may be friends simply because we are useful to each other. That's the sort of friendship that Aristotle thinks is especially characteristic of the old. He actually has a rather jaundiced view of old people, a position that I am less and less sympathetic to as things go along. We may be friends, especially because we give each other pleasure, the sort of friendship that Aristotle thinks is characteristic of the young. But the highest form of friendship will be a judgment that is based on the character of the friend, based on the belief that the friend's character is good. And that kind of friendship, Aristotle thinks, is most likely to be lasting. Usefulness and pleasure come and go, but character is rather firmly fixed. This highest form of friendship is a great good in, you may go, you won't bother me. You may bother them, but you won't bother me. This highest form of friendship is a great good in human life. In fact, Aristotle says no one would choose to live without it. But notice, great good though it is, one can have this kind of friendship with only a relatively small number of people. Of course, philia begins in goodwill, Aristotle says, and at least in principle, our goodwill can be unlimited. It's usually not, actually, but in principle, it can be. But from among all those toward whom you might have goodwill, you choose some in particular, based on aspects of their character, with whom you form close friendships. These people you spend time with, you rely upon. In them, you find a kind of mirror in which you can come to know yourself better than in almost any other way. How many friends of that sort should one have? Well, not a lot. About as many, Aristotle says, as you can reasonably spend time with on a fairly daily basis. So we can characterize Aristotle's understanding of philia as a love that is both personal and private. It's personal, that is, it is between particular people who are preferred for one reason or another. They are not interchangeable. You can't just slot somebody else in place of one. And it is private. Everyone is excluded who is not specifically included. And all you need to do is remember back to your high school years and the little circle of friends that you had and the delight you took in the fact that someone stood outside that circle of friends. We like to think we've outgrown that, but probably not, actually. At any rate, in these respects, in being personal and private in those senses, philia is rather like eros, which though eros grows out of different urgencies in human life, it is also both personal and private. But philia is unlike philanthropy, which is neither personal nor private. Philanthropia is simply equal regard for all who are generically human, whereas philia isn't really interested in generic humanity. It's interested in particular people and their particular characteristics. Notice that this also makes philia different from agape. Like philia, agape is, at least Christians say, personal, in the sense that each person is loved not just generically, but as the particular person that he or she is. But agape is not private, or so we say. It is a love that excludes no one. So friends are preferred for one reason or another to others, but no one is outside the circle of those whom we are to love agapeically. Now, when we think about friendship, philia, in Aristotle's world, it's hardly sufficient to say that it was important for him. More attention was paid to philia in Aristotle's world than has been given to it in the many centuries of Christian culture in the West. It wouldn't be wrong, in fact, to say that agape gradually displaced philia at the center of the moral life. And that displacement constitutes a massive cultural shift in the West, a transformation in our ideal of character. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics has 10 books. 2 of them are on friendship. Try to find a contemporary moralist who, writing his basic ethics, devotes 20% of it to the topic of friendship. I think you'll have to look for a pretty long time. Jeremy Taylor, a well-known 17th century Anglican cleric, put the point very nicely when he wrote, "When friendships were the noblest things in the world, charity was little." And by contrast, a certain kind of shift happened over the centuries in our world, producing a world in which close preferential ties, such as friendship, have become somewhat suspect. Why is that? Well, no doubt we could point to a number of reasons. There are no doubt lots of factors in such a shift. But whatever other reasons we might offer to account for this shift, surely one of them has to do with that man who, as I said before, is reported to have said, "If you love only those who love you, what reward have you? And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others?" So in that shift from the centrality of philia to the centrality of agape, something significant happened. And I want to think about that shift, about the tension between these 2 sorts of loves. And I think the tension turns on 3 different points, which are interrelated, but at the heart of it is preference. But there are sort of 3 differences that are important. The first is that philia is preferential. As I said, it's both personal and private. Some people are excluded. Those who are loved for particular reasons that go fairly deep into who they are. Not so agape. Kierkegaard has a wonderful passage in Works of Love where he says, suppose you have lived next to your neighbor for years. You wake up in the middle of the night once and the neighbor's house is on fire. You run out, rush into the house in the smoke and everything, and drag this person out of the burning house, only to see that it's somebody else. It's some stranger who's been there. And Kierkegaard says, no problem. You ran into the house in order to save your neighbor. And that's exactly what you did. You saved the neighbor. That's at least Kierkegaard's take on what agape means, but it's radically non-preferential. It doesn't depend on particular characteristics of the person. So that's one tension, that philia is preferential and agape is not. Second is that philia is reciprocal. It requires a return. It's mutual. It'd be very strange for me, no matter how much I care about you, it'd be very strange for me to regard you as my friend or to speak of you as my friend if you didn't care about me at all, never return that affection in any way, and indeed ignored me, sort of the way you ignored some of those people who were on the outside of your circle in high school. So philia requires a return, agape does not. But if everyone is to be loved as your neighbor in the way agape supposedly claims, then you can't make distinctions having to do with reciprocity. You don't distinguish between friends and enemies. Yeah, friends return your love, enemies don't, but agapeically, it makes no difference. And the third difference is that philia is changeable. That it's clearly the case that it is. Friendships sometimes die out, whereas agape is said at least to be steadfast and faithful. But since philia is based upon preference and reciprocity, it necessarily must change if the friend's qualities change or if that reciprocity is lost. So there's a series of sort of tensions between the two loves that distinguish them. I think that the problem of preference is the basic one of these. If no preference, no need for reciprocity. If no preference, no need to stop loving if the other person changes. So preference is at the heart of this issue, and preference has, I think, become suspect in our world. We could put that point positively, of course. We could say that we're committed to equality or equal regard, but it's not accidental, I think, that this suspicion of preference has arisen in a world that has been shaped by Christian love, by agape, because this is a tension that just haunts Christian thought, and therefore has haunted the thought of our culture more generally. Let me give you two examples, one from a philosopher, one from a very well-known Christian theologian. Here's the philosopher, a guy named A.C. Ewing, well-known philosopher at Cambridge University, mid-20th century. And Ewing once said this. He said, "It is clear that the money spent by a man in order to provide his son with a university education could save the lives of many people who were perishing of hunger in a famine. Yet most people would rather blame than praise a man who should deprive his son of a university education on this account." And Ewing held that view. Ewing agreed with those who would blame rather than praise a person for depriving his son of the education for that reason. But a contemporary philosopher, Garth Hallett, not too many years ago, wrote a book in which he started with Ewing's case, with Ewing's example, and then subjected it to analysis from every possible angle, actually more angles than the reader probably wants even. It's a thorough analysis, but Hallett did it in order to argue that we should probably praise the man who deprived his son of the university education in order to relieve a famine, and perhaps even Hallett thought one might have an obligation to do so. Not just that it would be a kind of supererogatory act that should be praised, but that he might be obligated to do so. Which, if Hallett's right, means that some of you perhaps should not be here right now. Now a Christian example from John Calvin, from Calvin's Institutes. And I just preface it by saying, I mean, Calvin is, I think I'm right in saying this, that Calvin is generally regarded as one of the most systematic and consistent of Christian thinkers. I mean, there's a rigor to Calvin's thought. This is a passage in the Institutes where he is commenting on the Good Samaritan story, which I'm just going to assume that you people all know. And he's thinking about the question, who is my neighbor? It's really the question that Jesus puts to his questioner at the end of the Good Samaritan story when he says, which of these three people do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves? This is what Calvin writes. He says, this is this most consistent of Christian thinkers. It says, "Now since Christ has shown us in the parable of the Samaritan that the term neighbor includes even the most remote person, we are not expected to limit the precept of love to those in close relationships. I do not deny that the more closely a man is linked to us, the more intimate obligation we have to assist him. It is the common habit of mankind that the more closely men are bound together by ties of kinship, of acquaintance, or of neighborhood, the more responsibilities for one another they share. This does not offend God, for his providence, as it were, leads us to it. But I say, we ought to embrace the whole human race without exception in a single feeling of love. Here there is no distinction between barbarian and Greek, worthy and unworthy, friend and enemy, since all should be contemplated in God, not in themselves." So what's Calvin's position? Kind of wobbles back and forth in that passage. Starts by saying that even the most remote person is our neighbor, that's what Christians say. But then he grants that sometimes we may think ourselves more obligated to some than to others, and that this may even be by the providence of God that this is true. But then the bottom line he returns to is that we ought to embrace the whole human race without exception in a single feeling of love. It's no surprise, I think, that even a thinker like Calvin wobbles back and forth a little bit there, because I said it's a tension that I think is just written very deep into Christian thought. And the very love that Calvin seems to regard as the bottom line there, that he exalts, this embracing the whole human race in a single feeling of love, can also, in certain moods, seem to us as deficient. You might not want to put it that way. You might want to say, well, clearly something wrong with agape. It's deficient in certain ways. But it can seem lacking. And what it lacks is apparent in a passage from Jane Austen's novel, Emma. In this passage, Emma is reflecting on her ambivalence about the character of a man named Mr. Weston, who turns out to be very important in the novel, finally. And it says, Emma perceived that her taste was not the only one on which Mr. Weston depended, and felt that to be the favorite and intimate of a man who has so many intimates and confidants was not the very first distinction in the scale of vanity. She liked his open manners, but a little less of open-heartedness would have made him a higher character. General benevolence, but not general friendship, made a man what he ought to be. So agape may seem to lack what philia clearly offers. Intimacy, the depth and warmth of a particular attachment, the sense of being irreplaceable, the sense that we're not outsiders. If I say to you, of course I love you. I love everybody. That's no doubt a good thing that I do, but it may not really warm your heart to be told that. And that's Austen's point there. So friendship is founded on distinctions which imply preference, distinctions which separate insiders from outsiders. If everybody's an insider, nobody seems to be an insider. That's our problem. And that kind of friendship is something quite different from the agape that Christians have talked about, and which, as Calvin put it, will not distinguish between worthy and unworthy, friend and enemy. So that's the tension that I always say that we're worried about. The truth is, that's the tension I'm worried about. You may or may not be worried about, but that I want to think about it. The question is how to deal with it. How do we relate these two loves of agape and philia? And I think there are at least three ways in which Christian thinkers have tried to work out the relation between these loves, to come to terms with this tension. I'm going to call them building down, building around, and building up. And I just want to work my way through each of those briefly. First, building down. On this view, we start with agape. Agape is fundamental here. Everything has to be derived from it. We start with agape, and then we build down from it. We build down within it to try to incorporate within it particular attachments as what you might call specifications of our universal love, specifications of our agape. So any particular attachment, any particular love must be derived from and justified on the basis of agape. We start with that. It's fundamental. The particular loves are just specifications of our agape. Anything that's not compatible with agape is not permitted. That may be, I think it probably is, the kind of view that Calvin was trying to develop in that passage that I read. How do we do this? How would we do this building down? Well, the most common way to do it, I think, is to build down by an appeal to human finitude, to the fact that we are finite creatures. Because we're finite creatures, we just can't be friends to all the world. It's not possible for us. Perhaps we can in some very general ways. You can wish well for everyone. You can pray for everyone. But love for all can't mean too much more than that. So we can say, because we're finite, we must love some more than we love others. How shall we do that in a way that is still compatible with agape, with that basic Christian neighbor love? Well, the suggestion of this first approach is simply that since we cannot love all, we begin with Calvin's single feeling of love for the human race, and building down from there, we incorporate into that love various kinds of distinctions. So our friends can be friends, and we understand our love for them as one of the particular specifications of our universal love, which we would show to everyone if we could. Now, this is an interesting move. It's interesting, especially in its attempt to make agape central, to take it seriously, and not to undercut its place in the Christian life. since Jesus, after all, requires that agape of his followers. Yet this view has its difficulties. Our finite condition may explain, I think it probably does explain, why we cannot love everyone as friends and must choose some. But will our finitude give any justification for preferential as opposed to random limits in our choice of those whom we love? That's the issue. Why not just become friends with the first 7 people who happen along if you decided that's about how many you can make room for in your life? Or the first 7 outsiders you find standing there in need of a friend, and who don't already have one. Why not do that? Well, because that's not what we mean by friendship, is it? Friendship involves other things. It involves age and intellectual endowments. More important still, probably, our shared interests and values. Maybe more important still, though a little harder to define, is some judgment about the total character of the other person. So that unlike agape, philia simply is built on differences. It doesn't seem to be just a species or a specification of universal love. It's a different kind of love. It has a different base and ground. So begin with the requirement of universal agapeic love, and even when you factor in our finitude, it's not altogether clear that you will arrive at a justification of friendship. You may have arrived at a justification of loving some people more than others, but you will not necessarily have justified loving them in the way we love our friends, which is to say, preferentially. So that's the first attempt. It's certainly worthy to try it. Work it out. If you work it out better than I just did, that's fine. We'll publish it together under both our names. Mine first, yours second. Now that's the way the scientists do it. We don't do that sort of thing in the humanities. So that's build down. Second attempt to work out this tension between the two loves, I call build around. For this second way, we don't start by trying to make one of the loves, like agape, central, the basis from which all else must be derived. We simply start by saying these are 2 different sorts of love. We're just going to grant that. We're not going to try to get from one to the other, as if one were just specifying part of the meaning of the other. Instead, we grant from the outset that philia and agape are different, but we want to say different, but compatible. Neither is primary in the sense that we try to derive one from the other, or that one sort of serves as a justification for the other. The relation between them is a different sort of relation. What sort? Probably, I think, this sort, if we're building around. What we'd say is agape sets certain outer limits. It specifies what we ought not do to any neighbor who crosses our path. But as long as we remain within those limits, as long as we stay within the boundaries that agape sets for us, and abstain from doing others injury or injustice, then we're left free within that area. We're left free within those boundaries to love preferentially whomever we will. So agape builds a wall of protection around our preferential loves because they're dangerous sometimes. It sets certain things off limits, even within those preferential loves, but then it allows those loves so long as we remain within the limits, so long as we don't allow our preference to harm others. So on this second view, on the building around view, there's no attempt to try to derive the urgencies of a particular love like philia from universal neighbor love, from agape. All agape requires is we try as best we can to treat everyone alike in certain basic ways. We refrain from injuring or doing injustice to any neighbor. But agape doesn't require friendship to all the world, some sort of impossibility. Rather, as long as we avoid doing evil to others, we are free to expend the rest of our energy in developing and pursuing important bonds like friendship. Now, you need not, of course. You could decide that you want to devote your life to relieving pain and suffering in the world and leave little time for friendship. That's fine. You can be the next Mother Teresa. That's okay on this view. But the thing is, the other choice is also just as permissible. You may, See to it that you don't harm others in certain basic ways, but having done that, you can devote yourself almost entirely to a small circle of friends in terms of your resources, your time, and your energy. And as long as in serving those friends you do no intentional harm to others, then we do not violate the requirements of agape. What about this as a way of trying to relate the two loves? Well, the one thing, maybe the first thing to be said about it and for it is that in a lot of circumstances it may seem to work pretty well. In fact, it is probably what most of us do most of the time, which is not in itself a justification for it. That may or may not justify it, but in fact, it's what most of us do most of the time. And we do it because it has a certain kind of common sense quality about it. It seems to make a place for both of these kinds of loves. And if instead of agape, we were talking about philanthropia, about that sort of love for generalized benevolence or equal regard for others, then I think this second approach would clearly work pretty well. We could just see philanthropia as setting those outer limits of our love, building a kind of hedge around our preferential loves, and then within that hedge, we could have our special friends and have a good conscience about it and not feel guilty. This will be a little harder to claim, though, I think, if we're working with the love that Christians call agape. I think Christians are always going to be a little uneasy about turning agape into what is essentially just a negative principle, a principle that sets certain boundaries in life but does little else. Because that seems to miss what you might call the positive, active quality of Christian love, the way in which agape always strains against whatever separates one person from another. You might even be tempted to think that there is in this second approach just a little hint of complacency with which agape is likely always to be uneasy. But as I say, probably most of us live this way most of the time. But if we're uneasy with it, if that complacency bothers us, we could try a third approach, what I call building up. Here again, we start with two different kinds of loves. We're not going to precisely try to derive one from the other, at least not in the way the building down view did. But in this case, we begin with philia. We start from there, and then we try to build up toward agape. We try to let philia open out into something more universal. How would this work? Well, friends are loved preferentially, to be sure, but for Christians at least, thinking within Christian thought, the friend is a gift from God, given by God, and therefore, like all God's gifts, meant not just to be enjoyed, but to lead us back to God. And that means, to use Augustine's terminology, that the friend must be loved in God. And if we learn to love the friend in God, we'll have to learn to love inclusively, since you can't have God unless you love those whom God loves, unless we're willing to love those whom God loves. So the friend, God gives the friend, but the friend leads us toward God, a God who seems to finally require love for all. Now that's a rather abstract way of putting the point. I'm not sure how helpful it is. I won't ask you how helpful it is. But a more concrete way to put it might be something like this building up model. On this way of thinking, philia retains its important place in human life. It's an important love in our lives. But in one way, it's also a very limited love, more limited maybe than those who praise friendship think of it. It has a certain role within the life of a Christian who is, after all, always on the way toward God. And that role is something like this, really giving ourselves to those who are our friends, really giving ourselves to even just one friend along the way will begin to make of us a different person. There's a kind of dynamism built into this love that will open it up in certain ways. So that learning what it means to love just one person, really to discipline our desires and learning how great an attack upon those desires serious love for just one person may require, we will gradually be reshaped and transformed. We'll become somewhat different people. That's the idea here. There's a wonderful example. It's not precisely about friendship, but illustrates the opening up a little bit. The philosopher J.L. Stocks, British philosopher, sort of early to mid 20th century, once told a lovely story. I think it's lovely anyway. Stories about a little 6-year-old girl who very much wanted a bicycle. She just, had this deep longing for a bicycle. And she learned that she was going to receive a bicycle as a gift from another girl who had outgrown her bike and was going to give it to this girl. So this little girl who had wanted this bicycle for such a long time found out she was going to get it, and she addressed to this bicycle a little poem, which goes like this. "Oh, beautiful bike, I love you so. It is so nice to see you go." You can see it's good poetry already. It's sort of my kind of poetry, actually. This is not T.S. Eliot. "Oh, beautiful bike, I love you so. It is so nice to see you go. I will wash you and clean you and take you home. Oh, beautiful bike, will you come?" Now, what a great last line that is to the poem. So this little girl's acquisitive love, this desire to possess the bike for her own and to enjoy it and give it all her special care and attention is transformed somehow into an appreciative love that simply delights in the bicycle's existence and gives it a kind of independence of its own. A kind of transformation in her love has taken place. It's opened up. It's broadened. And the idea here in the building up view is that we will become a little more the sort of person, devoting ourselves to our friends and realizing what a transformation that requires of us, we will become a little more the sort of person who might be able to love any neighbor who happens along. We'll be prepared, we could say, for heaven, that vast friendship, as the medievals called it. Or as Isaac Watts, a great hymn writer, described it in one of his hymns, "Come, let us join our cheerful songs with angels round the throne. 10,000 are their tongues, but all their joys are one." That's the image of heaven that Watts had, a vast friendship. So on this building up view, friendship is seen as important, but important finally, not just because it fulfills human lives, but because it's preparatory. It's a school of virtue in which God is at work on us to transform our limited capacities for loving and to open them up and make us more universally loving. Now, when I started on this building down, building around, building up, I said these are 3 ways that Christian thinkers have tried to sort of come to terms with this tension between philia and agape and solve them. I think the first 2 ways, though they have their problems, are really attempts to solve the tension, to work out a way in which the relation between the 2 is solved. I'm not sure that we should really, that we can really use the word solve of this third view, this third way of dealing with it, because the building up approach doesn't so much sort of resolve the tension in this life as it, though maybe in heaven, it does, when our love has been fully transformed, but it doesn't resolve it in this life. In this life, philia always sort of strains toward something that is more universal, but doesn't fully realize it. So the tension isn't resolved intellectually, it's simply lived. And that, I think, is the way this third view thinks of it. So in at least those 3 ways, I believe Christian thinkers have tried to come to terms with the tension between philia and agape. Of course, if you're not a thinker who likes tensions, you may think this is a fool's errand, but I think Christian thinkers have tried to do that. Look for a way to give friendship a valued place in human life without denying that it is not finally the central love to which Christians are called. Whichever of the 3 approaches we prefer or try to work out, we must, I think, simply recognize that it will have its difficulties and its complexities that we'll have to try to sort out, and I've tried to point to those for each of them. What I think we do have to say, we have to say 2 things, finally, about what we're trying to do here. First thing we have to say is that the Gospel of John tells us that when Christ came to this world, he came to his own. And therefore, the divine love that Christ displays, God's agape, cannot be entirely alien to the needs of our human nature, including our need for friends. There has to be some way to fit it into and work it out within the Christian life. The other thing we have to say, though, is at the same time that Christians said that the love that Christ displays cannot be entirely alien to our human nature. Christians also believe that the divine love that Christ brought displays possibilities that go beyond those that come naturally to us. And you have to find a way to say both of those things. And those two statements taken together show the limits within which we must think about a preferential love, such as philia. On the one hand, we have to affirm its value in human life. We can't simply say it is of no value. On the other hand, we have to note its limits, against which agape always strains. We cannot simply rest content in a partial, particular, preferential love like philia. Now, how best to manage that intricate simultaneity is a problem, I think, finally, that each of us must find a way to work out for ourselves. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll invite you to the microphone. Please. If you'd come up to the microphone and identify yourself, please, as well.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My question kind of comes towards the beginning of your talk where you talked about how friends were chosen. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that, because there seems to be a weird way in which that's true, but also that friends are just kind of the ones who like persist over time, that as you get to know somebody better, you become friends. So I'm wondering if you could clarify a little bit about what way in which we choose our friends.
Well, I will try. We'll just see. As far as persisting over time, I assume that a variety of people persist over time with us in some kind of contact, and some of them end up as friends and others don't. I mean, I guess that's the presumption of the question. I don't know that those who do become friends do so by accident. That just happened. They become our friends over time because of certain characteristics that they have that attract us to them and presumably them to us. So by saying friends are chosen, I didn't intend to mean that we are introduced to each other, we speak for a little while, and I say, aha, here's a person that I would choose as a friend. I don't mean that at all, but I mean that the basis of the friendship is finally grounded in certain kinds of traits of character that we find attractive and appealing and choice-worthy. That's not the only view of how friendship starts, though I think it's, on the whole, the right view. It's certainly Aristotle's view. And as I said, almost everybody who writes about friendship starts with Aristotle. Plato grounded friendship a little more in sentiment, actually. And there's some other, Montaigne's famous essay on friendship, famous but weird essay on friendship, does likewise. It gets increasingly hard to distinguish philia from eros. When you do that. I mean, it can be done, but it's more complicated. So I didn't mean to make it sound as if the choice was kind of such a definitive moment, but that it's grounded in finding certain aspects of a person's character choice-worthy. Something like that is what I'd say. And that can presumably happen over time. You could end up with a person as a friend whom you hadn't found particularly appealing until they sort of grew on you, so to speak. That's possible.
Please.
Yeah.
I'm about to get nailed here.
No, you're not. I think I can be loud enough. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So, Calvin. Let me start with Calvin.
You don't like Calvin, do you, Peg?
Yeah,
No.
that's okay. My likes and dislikes are not important here. So I can embrace the whole human race with a single feeling of love. Calvin, right? Okay. But on account of and that's easy for me to do. Okay. I love you all. Okay. The whole world. But I have roles that I am in life. And those roles are the source of obligations that I have. And I do not give up those obligations in the face of my attempt to embrace the whole world with my feeling of love. So what say you, Gil?
Well, as you know, I agree with you that we have those roles and obligations. If I didn't think that, I wouldn't have the problem that I had. Now, I grant you that in my understanding of the moral life, I am rather drawn to thinking in terms of some tensions, and not everybody likes that. But I think there is a tension there. But I guess what I would say is, yes, I do agree that there are those roles and obligations. I also know that Jesus said, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Well, we're back to the tension again, and we're going to have to look for a way to try to deal with that tension, whether resolve it or find a way to live it out, as I described the third view, so that I think we're I don't think that just acknowledging that we do find ourselves in these roles, and then that we choose some other roles also, that because we've chosen them, we incur obligations. I don't think that solves the problem finally.
No, I don't think it solves the problem either. I just think it reveals more the tension. But it also, as we mature, as we grow in our moral lives, and as some of these roles diminish, then I think the building up possibility becomes a little bit more real.
Perhaps, although I have I'll just be autobiographical for a moment. For years, when I lived in Ohio and taught at Oberlin, I am an ordained Lutheran minister, though I never made my living doing that. But for years there, I took care of congregations when they were without a pastor for a period of time, and I did the work for them while I was, teaching my full load and everything. It was a lot of work. Although, if you know anything about, I used to say, you'd have to know something about Oberlin to understand this. I used to say it probably kept me sane. There were moments when I wondered, and moments, I think, when other people wondered whether perhaps I did not neglect my children in order to do that. My response to that was finally, it's a good thing that my children should grow up knowing that sometimes there are things more important than them to me. Not all the time, of course. That would also, I would get the tension wrong then. But it won't hurt them to know that they're not always at the top of my list. And I think that's a way of trying to deal with that tension. You don't have to agree. That's okay.
Please.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. My name is Daniel. I'm a law student here. I was wondering what role we should place when we're considering these questions, the life of Christ, who was both God and loved all of us with an unimaginable love, but also had particular relationships within his life, as we see throughout the scripture when he calls certain people to follow him. John is called the disciple whom Jesus loved, and he mourns over John the Baptist. So what role should that play as we tease this out?
That's very nice. I mean, it's actually fascinating how certain examples recur in the literature about friendship, struggling with this. I can't recall or quote the passage exactly, but there's a passage in Boswell's Life of Johnson where Boswell is recounting a conversation that Dr. Samuel Johnson was having with some people, including a woman whose name I'm blanking on at the moment. But Johnson was saying that arguing that Christian love, the kind of love Jesus, it sort of didn't know friends or enemies, didn't make those sorts of distinctions. And this woman, first she had some kind of response to him. I can't remember what it was, but Johnson generally kind of ran down his conversational partners. But then she said, but what about the one is described as the disciple whom Jesus loved? And Johnson says, a very fine answer, ma'am, very fine answer. That is simply to say, I think, I mean, this is not going to be a satisfactory answer to you, but it's simply to say that since Christians affirm that Jesus was truly one of us, truly human, if I'm right that this sort of tension displays itself in human life, then it displays itself in his life as well. Now, how exactly I mean, I'm not privy to how he thought about this or worked it out, but that there were clearly distinctions of a sort that he made. That's true. And we're going to make them too, but I think we ought to worry about and try to figure out on what basis. But you're right. And it's an example that's been put forward before. I mean, he seemed to have three special disciples. John is the disciple in the 11 and so forth. It's just true.
I'm Schneider. I teach at the University of St. Francis. I'm going to paraphrase, or try to paraphrase what you said about building up as a way of at least reducing the tension between Philia and agape. And if I've succeeded in paraphrasing you accurately, I'm going to ask whether there's a kind of principle here that can be applied outside of the question of friendship. So you said that Philia strains toward agape. So I take from this that Philia is in itself a very good thing. It's just not the very best thing, that agape is superior to Philia.
You're doing well.
All right. If I've got this right, to say, I wonder if there's a kind of principle here, so I'll try out something else. Citizenship is a form of attachment to a particular community. It's a very good thing, and yet it's not the very highest thing. Am I right to see a kind of principle here that could be applied elsewhere?
Yes. Citizenship is a trickier one, actually. Let me start elsewhere. I think the family is a good example of the same thing. I think of both friendship and the family relation as schools of virtue, in which God is at work on us to widen and transform our lives. And the family is maybe even a better example of certain parts of it than friendship. You know, I talked about how really giving yourself to one friend constitutes kind of an attack on my desires and a disciplining of them. That certainly happens in the family as well. It's a way God goes to work on us. I think the same can be true of the civic relation, although what's trickier about it is that I do not regard regard the civic relation as a relationship of love. I mean, there is, of course, the classical tradition, the Greek tradition that thinks of civic friendship. I mean, there's a long tradition of it. It's been revived in modern times in various ways. Certain kinds of communitarian thinkers really tend in that direction to think of the civic relation as a form of love. I think for a variety of reasons that's mistaken. In fact, I think civic friendship was bad for the Greeks and is a bad idea in general. But insofar as we could think of the civic relationship that way, I would bring it under the same rubric. That's right. So there may be various kinds of human relationships that function as schools of virtue in that way, that God is at work on us.
Mark.
So, thanks. I really like to talk. I'm still trying to think through pieces of it. At various times in amongst the fathers of the church, they focus on the way in which certain types of relationships are central for helping us as we sort of struggle towards God and salvation. Okay? St. John Chrysostom, for example, makes clear the importance of being married and having children. And those kinds of relationships, in many ways, tracks a number of things you were saying. So the puzzle I'm having is, I'm not sure that friendship, at least the way it's often used, is a good way of talking about what it is to have a properly Christian marriage. And I don't mean that in the sense of, don't think of my wife as my friend. It's that the reason one gets married is that this is the person who's supposed to help you struggle towards God. not because you sort of are, best friends and you sort of like each other. I mean, you hope that happens also, but that's not really the focus of it. So there's something deeper going on. And it's the same with children. They're not my friends exactly. I have children. I'm supposed to be their father, and I love them, and I'm not sure which of those two categories to put it into. But there's something deeper that's going on there that seems to be not quite captured by the usual way in which we talk about the two types of love and friendship. And I don't have an answer. I just think if you had reflections on that. Sure.
I don't think one gets married for either of those sorts of reasons, by the way. I think it's much more down to earth. I think that it's quite possible, and has happened probably at certain times and places in certain cultural circumstances, in which the marital relation is not really a relation of philia in any very strong sense. I mean, Socrates didn't seem to think of his wife as his friend in particular. So that I don't think these have to come together, and marriage does not have to be, or the parent-child relation does not have to be thought of as a relation of friendship. In fact, the parent-child relation, I do not think of as a relation of friendship. I mean, the highest, at least, one always goes back to Aristotle. The highest form of friendship is friendship between equals, and just in a variety of ways, parents and children are not equals. There is a notion of friendship between unequals, and over the years I had various students write papers for my class arguing that their parents were their best friends, and so forth. I mean, so it's possible to argue that, but on the whole, I think that friendship implies a kind of equality that is possible between spouses, but not so much between parents and children. I don't think that I just don't think that you marry someone in order to have this person help you become more God-pleasing. If all goes well, that person will over time do it. But I think it's a function of the attempt to live within the relationship that does it to us. And as I say, I think of that as God at work through the relationship. God works immediately through those relationships. Now, I don't know if I'm responding to your question or not, but.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for your very interesting talk. I wanted to invite
They always say that first.
Right.
You know,
Right.
right.
I wanted to invite your further reflection on something you brought up in one of your earlier responses, which was your comment on Michel de Montaigne's essay on friendship. I was just interested to see if you could further elaborate on why you think it's so odd in light of your argument. Certainly, I think the element of eros there is a bit odd, but I also think it's not without precedent, including in our philosophical and theological tradition. For instance, the friendship between St. Basil the Great and Gregory, which is mentioned in their funeral oration, or in the Phaedrus, this idea of attraction through beauty. So, and of course, feel free to decline to respond. That'll be a good opportunity for humility for me.
How many of you have read Montaigne's essay on friendship? Yeah. I used to, not every year, but every other year maybe or something, I would teach a course that was called Friendship and the Problem of Preferential Love. And the first thing I always said to the students on the very first day of class was, I'd say, people come to a course on friendship for all sorts of different reasons. The only thing I can guarantee you is that whatever your reasons were for coming to this class, it will not be about them. Because I was interested in the problem of preference. Friendship was my case study. They came because they thought, we'd share Hallmark cards or something. But the first assignment they had in that class, before we'd really begun to work through any of the literature, was to read Montaigne's essay on friendship and write an essay about it, taking up anything they wanted to. in any time. There are millions of topics in that essay you can take up. And then actually at the end of the semester, we came back around to that, and they had to do what they don't want to do, come to my office for a meeting to discuss that essay they'd written at the start of the semester and see whether they thought about it differently now that we'd worked our way through the literature. 75% of them always wrote about Montaigne saying that the soul of woman is not hardy enough to sustain the bond of friendship. They didn't like that generally. But the thing that I had in mind, I've just been killing time here for a moment. The thing that I had in mind that you're asking about is that when Montaigne describes his friendship with Etienne, I can't remember the exact language, but Etienne came into the room, he set his eyes upon him, and, friendship. That's a lot more like Romeo seeing Juliet come in and saying, she doth teach the torches to burn bright, than it is what we generally think of as friendship. It's just got an erotic ring to it. Although Montaigne's sexual tastes were prolific. It's simply hard to find Montaigne's description of friendship as fitting what most people have thought about. He also thinks that the highest form of friendship, which he and Etienne had, is possible only with one person. That's really a limited friendship. Once again, sounding rather more like eros than philia. So that's what I had. That's all I had in mind. There are some other weird things in the essay, actually, though it's a wonderful essay for lots of purposes. But that's what I had in mind, and I won't worry about. Can't remember which of the fathers or the monks you had there, but I'll leave you to contemplate their relationship.
So I guess I'm Tom Hoops. I'm from Benedictine College. I guess I wanted to, and thank you for your excellent talk.
There they go again, right?
I want to defend the building around option, possibly because, like you guessed, that's the one I do. But you said it turns agape into something negative, where I don't think that's necessarily the case. Jesus said, if you give a cup of water in my name, you will receive your reward. And so maybe it just means that if somebody needs a glass of water, I'm willing to give them that. If I see somebody on the road and I can take them to an inn and take care of that, then I do that. And then I leave that person there to take care of my own business for my family, which is presumably what the Good Samaritan did throughout most of this time in the story.
He wrote a blank check, too.
Well, there you go.
Whatever you need, do it, and I'll pay you when I return.
Right. So which is not something that I could necessarily do for somebody. I don't know what but it doesn't seem to me that it has to be turn agape into a negative for it to work. It just seems like you proportionally give what you can to people with whom you come into contact.
Oh, fair enough. I may, for purposes of working out my tension, have made it a little more tension-filled than necessary. But the fact that guy needs, it does have. The way I described it, maybe you could find a way of describing it better. I may not have done it best. I described it as simply doing neither injury nor injustice to others, and as long as I don't, then I'm left free in the rest of my life to do this. Now, the fact that there are lots of people around who could use a cup of water doesn't mean I do them injury if I don't provide it. I do them injury if they have one in their hand and I yank it away from them. That's clearer. So, my description probably wasn't perfect, but the point is that I do think there's, you may want to disagree, I do think there's a hint of complacency in this, that, I haven't done great harm to anyone, so I'm okay, and all my time, energy, and resources go to these few people whom I especially love. It just seems unsatisfactory, I think. Now, how better to work it out, I don't know, and it may be that you could give a better accounting of the way agape works in building around that doesn't make it sound purely negative, and I'd grant that. but I'd like to see it done first, I guess. But there's something to that. I grant it.
Katie Breisek from the Thomistic Institute. Thank you very much.
From where?
The Thomistic Institute.
They're all over, aren't they? Benedictine, Thomistic. Go ahead.
So as you were talking, the thing that interested me was often when people are saying the preferential aspect of friendship, what they seem to be addressing is the delight that you take in the other person, which seems to be like a specific sort of, or like a kind of exclusive sort. And I'm wondering how that fits into your framework. I'm thinking of Joseph Pieper's essay on hope, where he's talking about how the Christian notion of charity, the Christian notion of love, tends to be more altruistic in a sense where you have a sense of, I am doing the most good, or it's the most meritorious if I'm not getting anything out of it. But he turned that around and said, have you ever wished to be loved by somebody for whom it wasn't a good thing? Like, you don't want your friends to not delight in your friendship. So that was kind of a niggling question for me. I was wondering if you could address that.
No, it's a nice question. And on the substantive point you raise, I think Pieper is correct. He's mainly worried about Anders Nygren in that context, and Nygren's notion of, Nygren wrote a famous book called Agape and Eros that I always say, he was a great Scandinavian theologian. I always say, I think Nygren's book is wrong, but it's such a great book that I would be glad to die having written it, even though I think it's wrong. So I think that's right, that the notion that I must get nothing out of this is mistaken, and friendship is supposed to be reciprocal. But the point of the mutual reciprocity there is that it sets limits to our love. We just don't have that kind of mutual awareness of reciprocity in all our relationships with others. I'm supposed to love agapeically people who not only don't seem to awaken that in me or me awaken in them, but people who are positively hostile toward me. So it seems to me that you can grant Pieper's point, but unless I'm misunderstanding, the problem still remains. Am I missing something?
I guess
You can say yes.
I don't know if you're missing something or I'm missing something, but I guess the other thought that's in the back of my mind is when Aquinas says it's more meritorious to love our friends than to love strangers. Because there's something about and maybe that's part of a virtue account, which includes the passions of things that you take delight in, or like what the will moves towards. That's an aspect of virtue, and the exercise of the virtue, which is pleasant to us, is good.
I'm always hesitant to comment on Aquinas in these circumstances. Aquinas is always looking for ways to do justice to all aspects, to work out a relation that does some kind of justice to all the factors that are involved. One might, if one is given to thinking that there are certain tensions that go very deeply into human life, the sort I was thinking about, one might be inclined to wonder whether Thomas did not smooth it out a bit much sometimes. And the notion that it's more meritorious, I need to think about that.
Hi, Derek Diedrich, University of St. Thomas. Thank you for coming. So my question is, in being that our love looks different as Christians, as it focuses more on becoming agape or having that tension with agape as opposed to someone who might not be Christian, does the way in which we form our preferential friendships or the friendships that we choose to pursue, how does that look different as Christians? Being more of, I know, I can reflect on a lot of the preferential friendships that I have, and I chose them because they were the better option, they were funnier, better looking,
You're still young. See, you're still Aristotle's youth there. But
Yeah, so that's my question. Like, how does the Christian go about finding those preferential friendships different than someone who's not Christian in order to bring us to that agape?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I'm not necessarily the best person to answer that question. I don't, just as I told my students at the start of class or whatever they thought the course was going to be about, that's not it. The fact that I have spent a good bit of time thinking about what I think is this interesting and important tension between philia and agape doesn't mean that I'm an expert on friendship, okay? I think that if friendships persist over time, and I mean, remember Aristotle says that friendships of the young, which are based on pleasure, tend to be changeable. The person who pleased you last year may not please you any longer this year. But insofar as these persist over time, I suspect we are likely gradually to move beyond rather more peripheral matters that delight us in transient ways and move toward aspects that are more deep in the character of the person. And if we are, then if certain kinds of, is not to say that a Christian cannot be a close friend with someone who doesn't share his or her beliefs, but if those things are really deep into someone, it gets a little harder to imagine a close friendship that persists over time and rests content with the fact that this person is charming or witty or something like that. Not sure that goes deep enough.
Yes.
When you were talking of Justice Hibschman studying computer science at this university, when you discussed the top-down method,
We call it build down.
build down. Okay, that's you discussed the notion of human limits, and I was curious to know when you talked about the building up, there were some things you said that maybe could be cast in the light of human limits, but you didn't explicitly spell it out that way. Do you see the notion of being finite beings and having limits as being part of your building up framework? And if so, could you comment on that?
Yes, at least if I understand you, what you're getting at, yes. Because the building up view starts with a sort of frank recognition that this limited sort of love that we only have for a certain number of people is important in human life. We're not going to run it out of human life in any way on the basis of some kind of claim about agape. But the thought is, or the hope is, that taking it really seriously has a transformative effect. I mean, see, if I'm going to, of the three views, I'm most attracted to the building up view, though I think it's not without its problems. But if I'm going to worry about it, what I worry about in connection with it is that it tends to suggest that there is just a kind of built-in dynamism to our preferential loves that will open up. And that's why I have to think of it very much in terms of God at work in us doing this. It can't be a kind of natural dynamism in it, I think, to be satisfactory for me. That's my worry about it. But yes, I think it starts with those limits and tries to accept them, actually, for something that's good in human life, but then come to terms with them.
We're about out of time. I'd like to thank everybody here and thank Gil again for an excellent talk and a very stimulating and friendly conversation.
Thank you.